This bill is a good idea.
I call Sue Moroney.
Thank you, Mr Chair. In rising to speak to part 2 of this bill, I think we may be getting to the crux of what this bill might be about, because what we're clear about, and I think both sides are clear about this now, they weren't last week but we are now, this bill is clearly not about creating jobs. Doesn't create one job. I think the government now accept that. They did start out saying that it was going to create something like 2,000 jobs, but that's clearly a nonsense because, as we've clearly demonstrated over the side of the House, actually pieces of law do not create jobs. Pieces of law like the 90-day bill did not create one job. Cutting wages under this bill does not create one job, and I think the government has clearly now got that because they've stopped using that argument. So I think that they have actually understood that it's a bit of a nonsense to say that this creates jobs. But if what my colleague Darian Fenton just referred to with regard to the amendment to the ACC Act that we are considering under Part 2 of this bill is in fact correct, that we are now debating paying young injured workers 80% of 80%, in fact, which I believe is what this amendment in this part does do, then I think we might have got to the real motivation for this bill from this government. Because if this government can get away with paying less in terms of ACC payments, it will do exactly that. And we may have got to the bottom of really what the government's motivation is here, because this would reduce the money that the government needs to pay out in ACC payments if this Part 2 was to be amended. This is a saving to the government's books. Why is this important? Because the government is desperate to save money in all sorts of inappropriate ways to fulfil their promise that they made to get back into surplus by next year. And one of the ways in which this government is trying to smoke and mirrors approach to doing that is that they have kept ACC levies artificially high. So they made an announcement at the beginning of this year, Judith Collins made the announcement, that despite the fact that ACC and Treasury both advised her to reduce the ACC levies, to reduce them, that would actually keep our very precious and important ACC system very well in place, reduce the levies. Judith Collins refused to do that. The John Key-led government is keeping ACC levies artificially high, and in doing that, and Mr Speaker, this is with regard to Part 2 because the Part 2 amends the ACC Act, and I just want to explain to people the context of this because this is something that the government is going after. They are trying to make the government books look better by keeping the surplus in order.
This is about the payments and consequential amendments to ACC. It's not about levies. It's not about ACC levies. It's about payments. I'll ask the member to come back on that. Sue Moroney.
Mr Speaker, the connection is that what the government pays out in ACC payments, if they can save money on that at the same time that they are keeping levies artificially high, then that increases the surplus that ACC makes. And the reason why the government is doing that is because they're trying to make it look like the entire Crown accounts are reaching surplus. But the nonsense to that is that the ACC surplus cannot be used for any other purpose but to pay for accidents and injuries. It can't be used for any other purpose. So it's a complete smoke and mirrors type of argument for the government to make it look like the government is getting back into surplus, when in fact what they're doing is using bills like this to reduce their costs in terms of ACC, in this instance to 15 and 19-year-olds, in order to make it look like, in order to create a bigger surplus in the ACC accounts, in order to make it look like they are reaching surplus in the Crown accounts. But it is actually those young people, those young working people who will pay the cost. They will pay the cost for that government's smoke and mirrors approach, because here they will be, young workers on 80% of the adult minimum wage to start off with, and if injured at work, they will be on 80% of 80%. And I don't know what members opposite, what their experience is like of living on the minimum wage. I would suspect that not many of them have had to do that. But, Mr. Chair, but here we're talking about an injured worker being on 80% of 80% of the minimum wage. So I'd ask the members opposite to reflect on how they think they could make ends meet if they were a 15 to 19-year-old and they were working and trying to live on $10.80 per hour. And then if they were that worker that I was talking about earlier in the debate, who's been forced really into accepting $10.80 to work for Wendy's Burgers in Hamilton, they won't have an option. It won't be voluntary. They'll be told, take it or leave it. The job is yours, but only at the rate of $10.80. Won't be a freedom of choice about that. They will be forced into that situation. They either say no to the job and then face sanctions by that very same government, or they accept $10.80 an hour. So there won't be a voluntary aspect in that at all. But if they're in that Wendy's burger joint that's coming into Hamilton, and they get forced into accepting the job for $10.80 an hour, and they have an accident or an injury is suffered at work, it could be, I don't know, hot fat. Those are actually quite common sort of injuries in that industry. I remember when I was working in that industry that hot fat from those fryers was quite unfortunately a regular sort of injury that was suffered by workers. If they actually suffer that type of injury, they'll be on 80% of $10.80. And that will be those workers, those 15 to 19-year-olds, paying the price for this government's promise to return the books to surplus by next year. They will be paying the price because the government actually gets to save money here. So this is not about employers or workers or opportunity or job creation or any of those myths and legends that the government has tried to tell us about opposite. It actually is about spending cuts from the government's perspective, as well as cutting wages. And the folly of that whole strategy is that cutting wages will actually lead to fewer jobs. Not job creation, Mr. Chair, but fewer jobs. Because if wages are cut in this way, there will be all of those 15 and 19-year-olds who have less money to spend. And when they spend less money, then there is an effect in our entire economy. So this bill demonstrates a complete lack of financial and economic management from this government. It shows that they've got not a clue what they're doing. Mr. Chair, I hardly ever agree with David Bennett. We come across each other quite a lot in Hamilton, and I hardly ever agree with him. But when he said in 2010, in a speech on this very issue about youth rates, that he, and I'll just quote from him, he said, "We do not feel that it is helpful in keeping focus on growth and growing the economy, which is needed to create jobs and which this government has made a top priority for this year." That's what he said in 2010 about the prospect of cutting wages for young people. He actually said it wouldn't be good for the economy. He was right. I agreed with him then, but I don't agree with him now. Because what he's telling us now, by the way that I expect he's going to cast his vote shortly in this House, he's telling us that it's no longer a top priority actually for the government, because he said back in 2010 that it was going to be a top priority. Creating jobs was going to be a top priority. But he also said back in 2010 that it was important that we don't set the bar too low, he said, in the sense that our young people who work hard must not find they get no reward for their efforts. That was David Bennett in 2010. 2013, sorry, I'm going into a bit of a time warp there. But not even, actually it was on the 21st of April to be fair, so actually almost 3 years later, David Bennett seems now absolutely happy to sell those young people down the tubes. And that's frightening, that in not even 3 years, he and his government have lost faith in these young people. They have given up on them, and they're going to lower their wages.
Mike Saban.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I'll pick up on the point from the previous member immediately. Quite the opposite, actually.